At First Christian Church of Louisville, we seek to be a movement for wholeness in a fragmented world, welcoming all to the Lord's table just as God has welcomed us. This is the vision statement of our congregation, and it provides for us the core principles of our mission in the world as a body of believers. And in it, we give very clear instructions. The first is that wherever it is in the world that we see brokenness, we are called as followers of Christ to step into that void of hurt and seek to provide some healing and some hope, to provide some wholeness in the midst of it. While we do this in many facets of our ministry, the pictures that are hanging around the sanctuary today and the pictures that hang throughout our building, even beyond the sanctuary, each one of them is a story. A story that's either been written by a congregation member or a partnering organization that is out in the world, stepping into the void of brokenness and living into our vision to bring healing and hope. And we take that call very seriously, and we invite every member of our congregation to ask the question, where is it that you see brokenness in the world today? And how is it that you can bring your gifts and talents and passions into that brokenness to provide healing and hope? And if not you, then who? If not now, then when? We are called as a people of faith to make a difference in our hurting world. And that's a big part of who we are as a church. Secondly, we are called to invite all who would want to come to the Lord's table to come just as we have been invited. At First Christian Church, we believe that at the heart of our offering of sanctuary to anyone who is seeking grace is the communion table. And at our communion table, everyone is welcome. And we say this over and over and over again, but it cannot be said too many times. All means all. There is no exception to the invitation to the grace of Christ that is found in this sanctuary. Everyone is welcomed here. And this welcome at this table is symbolic of our welcome as a church that seeks to be a safe place of sanctuary for all of God's children. We come here just as God made us in the image of God, and in our difference and diversity, we are welcomed into this place with grace and with hope and with love and with encouragement. We live into this call because we believe that at the heart of the call of Jesus Christ, at the heart of the gospel story, are elements of these very things. That wherever Jesus went, he was stepping into the void of brokenness and hurt, and he was providing healing and hope, particularly to the marginalized and those who were often seen as outside the will of God and the plan of the church and the hope of the world. Jesus was stepping into the midst of all of that brokenness, that fragmentation, and offering healing. And Jesus was a person who offered grace to all that he encountered, inviting them into the deeper grace of the God who is a part of who we are as a body of believers. And so as a body of believers, we are seeking to live out the gospel of Jesus Christ by living into his command to go to the edge of the earth, to the ends of the earth, from our doorstep to the ends of the earth, to be a group of people who are providing healing and hope in the midst of brokenness, grace and welcome and sanctuary for all of God's children who are seeking grace. We do this because Jesus first did this. And as his followers, we are called to continue living into it. And so for almost 2,000 years, Christians have been answering the call of Jesus Christ to do these very things. And each generation of Christians has been writing part of the story, a chapter, if you will, in the story of our faith. Building upon the foundation of the generations who had written the story before them, and hopefully creating an even stronger foundation for the generations that would follow. So the story that they write will continue to grow the faith and spread the faith to those who might need some healing and hope in their lives. And guess what? It's our turn. It's our time. We are now writing our chapter in the history of our faith. And while each one of us as an individual, and while this small church on the northeastern side of Jefferson County is just a small picture of the whole history of our faith, our call as individuals and our call to ministry as a congregation is no less important than any call to any individual or any congregation throughout the history of our faith. Every one of us has an essential role to play in the writing of the story of Jesus Christ for our time, but also in such a way that continues to build a strong foundation for those who are going to come after us. Of course, each generation, each individual, and each church must figure out how to discern that call. What does it mean for us to live into that call? And one of the things that differentiates First Christian from other churches and traditions is that call and that discernment is not left to any one person or small group of people. We are a congregational church. We are not hierarchical. That means that there isn't someone from on high telling us what we need to do and which calls and things we need to fall into and how we need to live out our faith in the world. We do that together as a community. And every single member of this community is given equal voice in that discernment. Why do we do that? Because we believe that no one person has the answer to what it means to be Christian in the world today, or how we're called to live out our faith as individuals or as a church. And so we come together as a group of people, each one of us bringing our belief and our faith and our understanding of God in our lives, and sharing in conversation to discern as a whole what it means for us to move forward. You have voice and you have vote in this congregation. You give us the leadership and the example that we need to move into in the future. We're practicing that today at our congregational meeting. At the congregational meeting, every single person who's a part of our church has a chance to vote. This is the one meeting of the year that I get to vote. This is it for me. This is my moment. I go to a lot of meetings, and I don't get to vote in any of them until today. Because not only do I work and serve this church and work at and serve this church in ministry, this is my church home. And I'm a member of this church just like you. Yes, as it's called spiritual leader, I certainly have influence. But that influence does not equate total authority. Because, friends, we are in this together, and it's only when we're in this together that we can figure out how God is calling us to move forward. And so one of the things that we do as a church is on a very regular basis, we call our congregation together, and we say, what are you hearing? What are you seeing? How's God moving in your life, and how's God moving in the world? And where is it that you see that God is calling us to continue moving as a church, to shift in the way we're moving as a church, and to make sure that we're engaging in the world in important, relevant, and meaningful ways? How do we discern ministry in the life of this congregation? We did that not long ago, in fact, just last September. We had some church-wide conversations where we invited members of our worshiping community to come together, and we just asked you some questions. And then you know what I did and your staff did and the called leadership for this particular time did? And we just shut our traps and we listened. We just listened to what you had to say. And we wrote everything down. Everything that you said as a group, we wrote down. And we had all these sheets and all this data, and we took all those sheets and all that data and everything you wrote down and all the answers to the questions that we asked you, and we compiled a report, a summary report of everything that you said. I've actually put a copy of that summary report on today's sermon page, and I encourage you to go and read that document. It's not very long, but you'll see the answers, the questions that we asked and the answers that you gave. And you'll see in there it's a phenomenal document. You did great work. And I think that the work that you did proves that God's Holy Spirit is moving in our congregation and it's moving in you. And you called us as a church and you gave us some direction as a church in some ways that I think are going to really shape our future. And we're going to be responding to all the things that you mentioned in that, and we're going to be working through it. But I want to let you know there were some things in that conversation that kind of rose to the top a little bit. A few things that really were mentioned on a broad scale and were mentioned by many of you, and they also came with some emphasis for us. And I want you to know that the leadership of the church heard you in that. And we're going to try to respond to that. For example, one of the things that you made very clear to us in those conversations is that you celebrate and believe that the call of this church is to continue being an inclusive place of welcome and grace. That First Christian Church is a big tent church. That in this church we welcome people across the theological, ideological, and political spectrum. And that no place on that spectrum is seen as more right or wrong than the other, that we come together across that spectrum and we honor each other and we respect each other and we work to grow toward love and grace toward one another, that in this place all are welcomed. You made it very clear that that is still at the heart of who we are as a church and who we are called to be. But in the midst of identifying that reality for us as a church, you also identified a place and a call that we really need to do a better job of living into. And this is the way you describe that. As we talked about ways that we can live into the world, it became clear to us that you see that one of the places of greatest fragmentation, where our society and culture is broken and fragmented the most, is in those very places where we seek to be welcoming. Theological, ideological, and political differences. That those things now are separating us and causing divisions in our society as much, if not more, as they have ever caused before. And you said to us that if we are going to live into our call to be a movement for wholeness in a fragmented world, if that is our mission, and at this point in history, one of the things that's causing the most discord and division in our families, in our schools, in our communities, in our society, and in our church, are differences in the way we deal with differences on a theological, ideological, and political spectrum. And if we know that and we don't address that, then we need a new mission statement. We need a vision statement. Because if we really are here to bring healing and hope in the midst of brokenness, and that's a place where we see and that's one of the places where we see the most brokenness, then the church has got to step into that void. And you asked us to help you have hard conversations and to talk about relevant things, to be engaged in difficult conversations. How do you do that? I mean, it's easier said than done. How do we gather people together of diverse and different ideas when it comes across those spectrums that we're talking about and come together in a way that we can share in conversation that draws us closer to one another instead of dividing us apart from one another? How do we do that? There are some who are very nervous about the idea at all. Afraid and very worried that as we enter into difficult dialogues and discussions, as we begin to talk about things that may be seen as theological, ideological, or politically divisive, that somehow we're going to cause even more division. And maybe it would be best as a congregation and as a church to not do that, so that this can be a sanctuary of peace and reconciliation without dealing with those things. And I get that. Because this can be unnerving, and this can be scary, and this can be worrisome. And we do have to be careful about how we enter into such conversations and journeys. Because if we're not careful, our hope to bring people together who differ in these ways could actually end up causing more split and more hurt and more division. So we've got to be careful. At the same time, we've got to learn how to have these conversations. We've got to figure this out. We've got to start working through this. I've heard it said so many times that there's some topics you just can't bring up around the dinner table or at the holidays. We don't talk about faith and we don't talk about politics because they're too divisive. And we've heard it said that in the church, we really shouldn't talk about ideological and political perspectives because the church needs to stay out of all of that. Well, I'm going to say this. If the church is telling you how you need to believe in those issues and isn't giving you room to disagree and be different, then yes, the church should stay out of that. Absolutely. But if we believe that God is the most important thing in our life and that Scripture and the Word of Jesus and the example of Jesus can shape us on our ideological and political perspectives, we're creating spiritual malpractice. if we don't talk about our faith and how it engages us in these important issues that we face today, we got to figure out a way to do that. I think part of the challenge for us and part of the reason that these conversations create more division than they do unity and reconciliation is, I don't know if it's because we forgot or if we've just lost the practice of having those conversations. I don't think it's the conversations themselves that cause discord, disagreement, and division. Because conversation itself doesn't have the power to do that. It's how we enter those conversations. Well, what if we could find a way, as a community of faith, to enter into the brokenness of those disagreements and learn again what it means to be in dialogue and conversation with one another? How is it that we can actually practice what we preach and come together as a diverse body of believers and find a way not only to respect one another and gain understanding for one another, but I know this is going to sound a stretch, maybe we can actually learn from one another, even from the ones we disagree with the most. I want to share with you a biblical model for this that I think is so important. It's more of a biblical tale about the importance of this, and it's coming from a familiar parable, which I most of you have probably heard, at least in part or something like it. But I think it gives us it starts to build the foundation for this conversation. It begins this way. We're looking at the Gospel of Luke. Just then, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Great question. Jesus said to him, "Well, what's written in the law? What do you read there?" And the lawyer said, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You've given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." But, wanting to justify himself, he asks Jesus, "All right, who is my neighbor?" And Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead." Now, I know you probably know what's coming next, but before we get to that part, I just want to point out something that's really important. There's no descriptor about this man. We don't know his race, we don't know his ethnicity, we don't know his religion, we don't know anything about his political or ideological inclinations, we don't know his education level, his wealth, his profession, his status in the community. We don't know anything about him. And this is important because if we knew something about him, we might be tempted to blame the actions or inactions that are about to happen on him. This has nothing to do with him. It has everything to do with the people who are either going to respond or not respond. So this is going to cause introspection in terms of reaction. No blame can be put on the victim here, right? Right. Now, by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, also passed by on the other side. Now, as opposed to the man, we're told exactly who these two people are. We got a priest and we got a Levite. They're at the core of the religious community. And in that day and age, they were the ones who were to set the model for everyone else. If you were part of the community of faith, they were like your coaches. You were on their team. They're going to tell you everything you need to do, and you want to follow their example. So they were big religious leaders, and we're looking to them for religious guidance. They come by, they see the man on the side of the road, and they cross to the other side. Now, if you go study this, and if you've heard some sermons on this or messages on this, you're going to hear people talk about some religious and traditional reasons as to why they crossed the road. There were some laws and rules and customs that they were trying to live into in order to do it. There are plenty of excuses for why they crossed the road. But Jesus is about to say, none of those excuses amount to a reason. And he's about to blow up all those excuses. There is no excuse or reason for them to have crossed the road. He doesn't care who they are. And he makes that point with what he says next. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. Not only that, the next day he takes out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, "Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend. So Jesus asked the lawyer, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? And the lawyer said, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said, go and do likewise. Now, in order to get at why I think this story speaks to us today, in the topic that we're having in terms of crossing these divides that we face as a community, is to remember that the Jewish community and the Samaritan community were enemies, and hardcore enemies. And they did not, there was no nuance here. There were good guys and there were bad guys. There were good gals and there were bad gals. And the good guys and gals were on your team, and the bad guys and gals were on the other team, and that's just how it was. No room for nuance. And so if the good guys did something, that's what you should always do. And if the bad guys did something, that's what you should always do. And so in this story, and just a reminder, the lawyer who asked the question is Jewish. And so in the story, he's saying, well, what do I got to do to live? And Jesus says, well, you got to be a neighbor to people, you got to care for people. Well, who is my neighbor? And so he tells this story. And in the story, the lawyer's team walks by. The enemy's team cares for the person by the side of the road. Now, I assure you, in that day and age, when people heard this story, if they were on the Jewish side of the fence, if they were on that team and they heard the story and they knew that their enemy was going to help the guy on the side of the road, they're probably thinking, something's up with that. If the Samaritan is doing that and our team is walking by, there's probably a reason to walk by and not a reason to go over there. We're not going to trust the Samaritan actions. We're going to trust the actions of the priests and Levi. There's no nuance here. You got to pick your side, pick your team, and that's what you go with. In today's world, we get some of this, and we see it a lot. And the way that I describe it is often when we're in conversations or we're seeing something happening, we consider the source before we consider the situation or the truth behind the situation. And this is what I mean by that. If we know the person's theological inclination, their ideological inclination, or their political inclination, if we know that going into the conversation, and they are asked a question and they answer it in a particular way, part of our willingness to accept their answer, hear their answer, learn from their answer, or respect their answer goes with which team we're on. If we're on their team and we know they're on our team and they say something, we'll go, yeah, that's probably pretty true. That's probably pretty true. But if they're not on our team, they're on the opposing side, the opposing team, even if we don't know anything about the issue, if they say that's the right answer or the way that we need to be, we say, well, probably because they're on the opposing team, we probably shouldn't pay too much attention to that. We should probably hold that in suspect. So we pay attention to the source before we pay attention to the situation and the truth behind the situation. Now, I'm not saying don't consider the source, because I do think that shapes how we respond. But what I'm suggesting is that sometimes we lose our nuance. And we begin to believe that you're either with us or against us. And if you're on our team and you say something, I can buy in. If you're not on our team, I got to say no. So how does that play out in today's world? In today's world, we are more likely to defend the actions of the people in this parable based on whose team they're on and whose team we're on. So if members of our team walk by the person who's wounded, members of our theological, ideological, or political teams, if they walk by the person who's wounded, we're going to figure out a way to justify that and defend that. If members of our team cross the road and take care of it, we're going to find a way to defend and justify that. But if we're on the team over here and someone crosses the road, we're going to hold them in suspect and say, they're trying to, what's up? Why are they caring for that person? Why would they do that? That person found themselves there. Not our problem. We would find a reason to attack. They're helping that person. As proof of this, they recently did a study about compassion among people, and they did it specifically among political parties. And you know what they found out? People were more likely to help people who were wounded or in need if they shared the same political party. And if they were in a different political party, they were more likely to cast blame on the person who was wounded or injured or in need and say they got there because of their own personal actions and to walk by and leave them there. We've gotten to a place where we're living out this parable. And members of our team are passing by because it's a member of the other team that's lying in the gutter. And so we begin to recognize that in this moment, we are losing this sense of nuance and this sense of place. And I think the gospel is trying to speak to us and call us to a better way, to a way that moves more toward truth. Here's where the lawyer was pressed. And I love this moment. So the lawyer has a choice to make. He either has to choose his team, members of the Jewish religious leadership who walk by and leave the man to die, or he's got to choose the enemy, the one who did the right thing and cared for the person lying by the side of the road. He either has to defend his team by denying the truth and talking about what was right, or he has to sell his team up the river by saying our enemy was correct and we should be more like our enemy. The lawyer chooses truth over side and goes and cares for the person. And Jesus says, you need to go and do likewise. So the question is, who's your neighbor? Who is your neighbor? Simple answer, everyone is your neighbor. Plain and simple. There is no differentiation. Everyone is your neighbor. When it comes to the gospel of Christ and the kingdom of God, there are no different teams. We are on the same team, and everyone is your neighbor, even your enemy. And if we ever want to cross the divides that are splitting us apart as communities, we have got to begin to see that before we see anything else. Because that is one of the greatest commandments that we've been given, and if we want to have life, we have to treat our neighbors we have to love our neighbors as we love ourselves. So here's what we're going to do over the course of the next several weeks. We're going to dive in. We're going to talk about it. Next week, I'm going to continue to build the foundation because there's some more work we need to do to talk about why this is important, why the church needs to be in the middle of this conversation rather than on the outside of the conversation. Okay? We're going to do that first. Then what we're going to do is we're going to talk about actual practical skills that we can take, practical steps and practical things that we can do to begin to follow a more Christ-like model when it comes to those things that are tearing us apart. Just a reminder, in case you aren't aware of this is an election year. And if you think things are tense today, wait till October, right? Okay? What we're going to do is we're not going to just sit back and watch that. We're going to get into the middle. We're not going to get in the middle of it and tell you what to do. We're not going to do that. What we are going to do is we're going to encourage and offer you some ways and some ideas about how you can engage in the middle of that. How you can be a presence of healing and hope in the midst of that instead of someone who's adding to the division of that. And what does that look like for you? We're going to talk about that. And then we're actually going to practice it. We're not going to force anybody to come and do it. But we are going to give you opportunities to come and practice meaningful, reconciling dialogue about issues that are important to you and issues that are important to God. And we're going to see if we can't figure out how to do this. I'm grateful to be a part of a church that said to its leaders, this is what we want to do. We want to do it and we need to do it and we're going to hold you to account. I was so clear with one of our board teams. I said, look, I'm willing to do this, but you got to tell me I'm going to do it. And they said, yeah, you're going to do it, buddy. It's okay, then we'll do it together. The other thing that I want to ask you to do is if this gets kind of bumpy and rough, if we find ourselves stressed and worried, please don't cross to the other side. Please don't walk by the issue and leave it there. Cross over because your neighbor's waiting. Your neighbor needs you to be there. And I can't wait for us to find a way to do just that. Amen.